driven by their own determination, they have taken to the streets and now taken to the ballot box and to other mechanisms of change to achieve full citizenship, to have the rights and the responsibilities of citizenship. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Is that good? People can hear? Thank you very much. Everybody can hear in the back. I'm honored and pleased to be here at the Couchiching conference, and even though it's a short trip, I'm only here for less than a day, but it's always a pleasure to meet new people and eat that wonderful Canadian crispy bacon in the morning. And those two things are not exactly equal value. The people are more valuable, but it's it's close.
No, I'm not. I just couldn't.
I have about 25 minutes, so there's not a lot of time, but I want to use the time to basically share with you my views of what I think is actually happening in the Arab world, what are the important issues that are actually important and historic and new and significant, and what this portends for the people of the region, as well as for the rest of the world, including Canada and the rest of the Middle East. I was asked first to speak on minorities, and I said that really didn't make a lot of sense, because I think one of the mistakes that has been made analytically and politically throughout the world, especially in the Western world, especially in North America, over the years, has been to take a much too narrow a view of these issues in the region and to try to focus in on women or Christians or youth or unemployment or education or madrasas or any one issue. All of these are important issues, but when you zero in on one of them and emphasize it, you lose the big picture and you lose the view of what is truly significant in terms of both the human sentiments that drive change in the Middle East and the significant political processes underway. So I said I'd like to speak about minorities, majorities, and citizenship in the transforming Arab world, because the real significance of what's going on now is that we are seeing, I believe, the birth of two historic phenomena in the Arab world. Historic meaning they've never really happened before, ever, in ancient history and modern history. We're seeing the birth of a process of national self-determination that is rolling across the region, country by country, driven primarily by the determination of its own people to live as normal people with freedom, dignity, human rights, opportunity, decency, whatever you want to call it, but to live a normal life. And this self-determination process is in its early days, and it's just starting to take shape in places like Tunisia and Egypt and Libya and others to come. And it will roll around the region into other countries, some of the monarchies, Sudan, Morocco, Algeria, etc., others. The second thing that's happening, which is historic, is that we are seeing the birth of the modern Arab citizen. We've never had citizens in Arab countries. The Arab people were subjects, many of them were subjects of the Ottoman Empire, neglected subjects mostly. Then they suddenly, presto, after World War I, found themselves nationals of new countries. So suddenly you were a Jordanian, you were a Kuwaiti, you were an Egyptian, you were a Syrian, you were an Emirati, these new countries that were born. And I'm not saying they shouldn't have been born, I'm just saying that it was rather strange how they were born. And suddenly, people who were members of a certain tribe or a group, and then they were subjects of the Ottoman Empire, suddenly became citizens of these countries, or nationals of these countries. But they never became citizens. They never had the rights of citizenship. What's happening now is that, driven by their own determination, they have taken to the streets and now taken to the ballot box and to other mechanisms of change to achieve full citizenship, to have the rights and the responsibilities of citizenship, to be protected by institutions of law that guarantee equal rights and opportunities, at least when you start life, you start with equal rights and opportunities. Some people will progress faster because they're smarter, they work harder, they have better good luck, whatever. But you at least start life with a reasonably equal opportunity with everybody else in your society to work hard, to go to school, to make money, to travel, to be creative, to do whatever you want. And there's now several 100 million people in the Arab world who are not only struggling for these rights, but actually dying for them. You see it in Bahrain and Syria, and you saw it in Libya and other places, and it will roll across the region. There's more to come, I believe. But essentially, people are saying, we don't want to just be consumers. We want to be citizens. We don't want to just have 17 shopping malls in our country. We want to be able to vote for our government, to hold power accountable, to have standards of equity, to have quality education, to have clean water for everybody, to have affordable housing, but most of all to have trust and confidence in the legitimacy of our ruling institutions. And this has been widely absent in the region. Polling by the Gallup organization and other reputable people in the Arab institutions and international institutions, polling in the last 2 or 3 years across the entire Arab world showed very, very clearly that there was a massive gap in trust and confidence among ordinary people in their ruling institutions. In most countries, it was around 50%, 50 to 45 to 55% of the population had no confidence in the government. Only around 30 to 35% of people across the Arab region had any confidence in elections. Most people thought elections were completely fake and didn't even bother going to them. There was very little trust in the judicial system, in the political system. Even in the media, trust was very low, except for the new satellite stations like Jazeera and others. So there was a huge gap in confidence, in trust, and in legitimacy. And what's going on now is an attempt by Arab people to actually achieve their rights as citizens and to then shape their own countries, their institutions, their values, their principles, their policies, accountability mechanisms, participatory mechanisms. And this has never happened before. So the process of self-determination and the birth of the Arab citizen are the two overriding big picture issues that I believe define what's going on in the Arab world. But the nature and speed and scope of this process of change is also unprecedented, because what has happened in a country like Tunisia or Egypt or now Libya, the three that are most advanced, is that they have compressed into a very short period of time, in some cases less than a year, processes that in other countries, including yours and the United States and Great Britain and others, took somewhere between 2 and 3 centuries. And if you, I don't have time to go into great detail, but I'll just mention that if you look at Egypt today, which is the most dynamic example, though Tunis is more advanced and less dynamic, there's less action, political action and street action, but Egypt is the most fascinating because it captures most accurately what's going on. And I think if you look at Egypt today, we can see that simultaneously the Egyptians are experiencing the equivalent of what you experienced in the Western world, in your democracies, the equivalent of wars of independence, processes of national self-determination, mechanisms of constitutional consensus on agreeing how your constitution works, re-legitimization or legitimization of the institutions of government, a process of democratization, basic democratic institution, to some extent a ideological civil war, not necessarily a military civil war like the Americans and others had, but an ideological civil war among different groups, a working out of issues of identity, national identity, communal identity, and individual identity, and how these different identities come together into a single national structure. You know this very well with your various, the Quebecois, the indigenous native Canadians, some of the people out west, the various groups you have. You have a very lively, and it's still going, you're still working out how do you bring together different identities into a single country. The issue of minorities and majorities, how do minorities fit into the majority? How do you assure majority rights while protecting minority rights? The issue of the balances between military and civilian power. This is, in my mind, the single most important issue in the Arab world today. The balance between military and civilian rule. And one of the reasons Turkey has developed so well is because they got that balance right. The civilians now oversee the military to a large extent. The balance between religious and secular ideas. And this is an issue that is widely discussed now, but this is an ongoing process which is very, very complex and very dynamic. The balance between the central authority of the government and the capital and the regional provincial authorities, which is again something you've dealt with and the Americans and others have dealt with in advanced democracies. The quest for social justice, which I believe, having watched these revolutions and interacted with many people, I believe the quest for social justice is the single most important driving force for these revolutions. And that includes, obviously, a democratic process. But the sense of social justice, that people are treated decently by their own society, that most people in society, all people in society have a reasonable expectation that the public institutions of their country will serve them equitably and fairly. The drive for social justice is a huge process that is just unfolding now. The drive for economic well-being and growth, a new social contract that includes political and social and cultural values between the governed and the governing. Civil rights for all. Took the United States well over a century and a half to give black people the vote, and then also took you many centuries in the West to give women the vote. So the battle for civil rights for all. All of these things are happening simultaneously, with the added stresses of the repercussions of the Arab-Israeli conflict, which remains the single most destabilizing and radicalizing force in the Middle East, to my mind. Without a resolution of the Arab-Israeli conflict, none of these historic processes will ever find full stability, because the Arab-Israeli conflict will remain a destabilizing force. And then the question of global intervention or interference in our region. The Russians and the Americans have now resumed their at least competition in the region, and I am happy to declare here officially tonight that the post-Cold War period is now officially over. We've finished the post-Cold War period. We're now into the new lower intensity Cold War period of a serious ideological competition between the Russians and the Americans and the Chinese and the Americans, and most of the other people are hanging on or watching. So these are things that are happening all together, and the incredible complexity of all of these things happening in the span of 16 months. 16 months, when these things took about 2 to 3 centuries in advanced Western democracies. And ultimately, what some people feel they are doing in the Arab world, and I agree with this, is that we are fighting the last anti-colonial battle. This is the last battle for liberation from the remnants of the colonial period, because most of these regimes in the Arab world are somehow linked to the structures that were left from the colonial period and the period of decolonization, which led to independence for many countries in the Arab world, but never real sovereignty. And therefore the real prize here of citizenship and and self-determination. The real prize is sovereignty, to be truly sovereign as an individual, as a citizen with rights, and as a country with your own capacity to shape your institutions, shape your policies in the best interest of your own people, not as happens now in the best interest of what the Western governments will allow you to do, or lobby groups in Washington and Ottawa and other places, and Paris will let you do, or what the Israeli government will allow you to do. This is one of the things that these uprisings are fighting against. But they're not on the surface. These foreign policy issues, these degradations of sovereignty and dignity, are deep drivers of discontent that come together with the quest for citizenship and dignity and the demand for material well-being to push this unprecedented force of several 100 million Arab people around the world struggling and in many cases dying for their ability to live as normal people in normal countries. In other words, to be a citizen in a sovereign state. So the complexity of this is really enormous, and we should shy away from any attempts to simplify this into one or two issues. But the process, this complex process, can be studied individually. You can take elements and study them, but you should only study them within this entire complex of events that are taking place. And if we're talking about minorities and majorities, the real question, the real challenge for us is, can we in the Arab world, at the level of individual countries, create institutions of governance that reflect the will of the majority and protect the rights of the minority? The simple answer to that is, yes, of course we can. There's no question that we can, but we need to be given the opportunity to do so, free of interference from nearby or far away military powers. And this is what's, I think, historic now, that we're starting this attempt by people in the Arab countries to actually shape their own mechanisms of asserting the will of the majority and protecting the rights of the minority. And when you talk about minorities, there's plenty of them. This is a very pluralistic region. But two dominant groups are Sunni and Arab people. Sunni Muslim and Arabs tend to be the majority across the region, but you have several dozen minority groups, Christians, Druze, Alawites, Kurds, Jews, Baha'is, Amazigh or Berbers, Armenians, Circassians, Shiites, Animists, Yazidis, Bedouin, people who don't have nationality in Kuwait and other places, Akhdam in Yemen, and many other smaller groups like this. And in some cases, Sunnis are a minority, like in Iraq, or Shiites are a majority. It varies. One time, years ago, the Christians were a majority in Lebanon. They're no longer a majority. So this question of majority and minority is also changing over time. And then you have groups of people, women, youth, disabled, others who are who can be categorized as a group. They're not necessarily a minority, but they're a group of people who are somehow disadvantaged and not allowed to exercise their full rights as citizens or human beings. So how do we analyze these groups? First of all, there's no single analysis that cuts across the entire region. It's impossible to say, as some people simplistically try to do, that, well, Christians feel like this, or Shiites feel like this, or women feel like this. There's an immense variety of sentiments and conditions in the Arab world. But I think we can get an idea of what minorities feel by going back to look at what the majorities want. And this is my central point to you, is that there is actually no difference between minority and majority. The history of our region has been that minorities have been probably the most deprived groups in the autocratic and sometimes authoritarian states of the Arab world in the last 2 or 3 generations since the 1940s and 50s, the minorities tended to be the most disadvantaged because they didn't practice their full rights of citizenship, and they also were not, in most cases, allowed to manifest their full identities as minorities, whether it's language or cultural life or other issues. But to really understand what minorities are feeling, we have to go back to the majority. And I think if we go back over the last year and 4 months, 5 months since the beginning of the uprising, and we ask ourselves, what is it that people have been asking for? What is it that they've been expressing? If you go back to Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, Bahrain, Yemen, etc., and then places like Jordan, Morocco, Oman, Kuwait, where there's been other manifestations of certain amounts of grievances, but not revolutionary fervor to overthrow regimes, but certainly clear discontent and grievance. What is it that people have actually been expressing? And I divide this into 2 things. What are they expressing? What are they saying? And then, what is it that they're asking for? What do they want? And when they fix their societies, what do they want? I think we have to start at the first level to really grasp what's wrong with these societies, what's bothering people, what are their grievances, and what is it that has driven them to go out into the streets and do this. They're expressing their identity, and many identities, religious, ideological, political, gender, cultural, whatever it may be. They're expressing that they have rights. They're expressing an awful lot of anger that's been built up over 2 or 3 generations of abuse by their own power structures. And the key here is that the abuse is by their own power structures. We have huge complaints against the behavior of Israel, behavior of the United States, more recently the diplomatic behavior of Canada, other Western powers, historically, England and others. We have huge grievances and complaints, but none of them appeared in the last year and a half as serious drivers of these revolts. They're underneath the surface, and they will come. They will come soon. But right now, people are expressing anger at their own domestic abuse by their own power structure. They're expressing a need for material rights, to housing, water, food, schooling. They're expressing a need to, they're expressing a discontent that they're disempowered, that they don't have any power as citizens. They can't do anything other than go buy cell phones at the shopping mall. They're expressing that they feel there should be equality and social justice in society. They're expressing a profound need for fundamental dignity, the dignity of their citizenship and the dignity of their humanity at the same time. They're expressing a deep, deep need for justice, and they're expressing a desire for pride, just to be proud. And you saw this in Egypt, where they held up signs, "I'm proud to be an Egyptian." I have one in my office, and it's very powerful when subjugated people regain their pride and regain their humanity. It's one of the most epic and moving episodes. You saw it with Nelson Mandela in South Africa. You saw it with Aung San Suu Kyi in Myanmar. You've seen it in many places around the world. And you should see the same thing in what people are going through in the Arab world, to regain their fundamental pride and to be rehumanized. What you're dealing with is several 100 million dehumanized Arabs who have been dehumanized by the combination of their own autocracies at home, economic and social stagnation, humiliation in their confrontation with Zionism in Israel, and subjugation in their historic unhappy encounter with Western imperial and colonial powers going back several hundred years. The combination of those 3 circles of global, regional, and domestic humiliation has been so deep and has gone on for so long that it has fundamentally taken people on a journey from annoyance to discontent to disadvantage to anger and ultimately to dehumanization. And they don't want to be dehumanized. They want to assert their full humanity. And these are what people are, these are the things that people have been expressing. And then and if you look at all of these points, every one of these applies to the minorities. If you're a woman, if you're whatever minority you are, if you're a Amazigh, if you're a Kurd, if you're a homeless Bedouin, if you're a Shiite in Lebanon in 1955, before the Shiites picked themselves up and became a strong power rather than a subjugated, weak minority. These are common to the majority and the minority. And then if you distill these issues and say, okay, what do they want? What do these people want? What do the minorities want? What do the majorities want? Again, I would say it's the same thing. They want trust in their state institutions. They want legitimacy in the exercise of power. They want citizenship rights that are equitably applied. They want constitutional reform and the rule of law to guarantee those rights. And they want an affirmation of fundamental principles of social justice. Those 5 things, I believe, trust, legitimacy, citizenship rights, constitutional reform, and social justice, strike me as the 5 common denominators across the entire region. If you look at what people in Jordan are saying, people in Morocco, people in Oman, other places where they haven't gone out into the streets in huge numbers, they're asking for these things. So if you look at the list of these issues, then go back to the issue of minorities. What is the situation of minorities today in the wider context of these epic transformations and these battles? If we go back and ask, what is it that the minorities are feeling? They're feeling 2 things. Many minorities are feeling what they felt for the last 50, 60 years, which is vulnerability, fear, disadvantage, inequity, and some of them to the point where they immigrate, and probably some of those people are sitting in this room and are now happy Canadian citizens, eating bacon and enjoying life. And most of the people in the Arab world who are fearful minorities don't have the opportunity to immigrate. And they have to basically figure out what to do. And in historical terms, there's not much they have been able to do. They haven't been able to change the prevailing norms of the exercise of power in Arab countries. They've tried, in many cases, human rights movements, women's movements, democracy movements, Islamist movements, student groups, labor groups, but many attempts in the last 30, 40 years, all of which have been crushed by the power of these regimes. But the second thing that minorities are doing, as well as being chronically vulnerable and fearful, is that they are actually taking advantage in some cases of the opportunity now that has opened up with these historic Arab uprisings, which is the opportunity to engage in a new public sphere of political activism, to engage with others in society for your rights as a citizen, not for your rights as a minority. If minorities keep seeing themselves as minorities, they will remain perpetually vulnerable, and they will continue to dwindle and leave, and we will lose the Jews, the Christians, the Kurds, the Armenians, the Circassians. We'll lose most of the minorities, and that would be a terrible shame. And it's important to study minority issues, not just because of the rights of the minorities, not just because of the rights of those people. It's important to study minority issues because they tell us a lot about the quality of our statehood, and they tell us a lot about the values of the majority. And therefore, how minorities are treated is a reflection of how majorities function and how the institutions of statehood operate in our region. The opportunity now for all citizens, majorities and minorities, to engage in an open political struggle for the reconfiguration and re-legitimization of these Arab states and their governments and their power structure. That opportunity is one that nobody has ever had before in the Arab world on a serious basis. You could before join a political party, go to vote, join an NGO, but it was complete fiction. There was no chance of any real change coming through that process. Now we see in Tunisia, Egypt, and Libya most clearly, we see something very different. We see a very dynamic process of different groups in society engaging one another in a tough and ongoing political battle to shape the country, to shape the values, to shape the institutions of state. And one of the interesting things that's happened is that, if you look at Egypt, we have now in the stage of public political action, we have all these actors that weren't there before. We have the military, who of course have been there since 1952, but the military are now out in the open. They've been flushed out of the shadows, and they're out in the open. The SCAF is negotiating with the other political groups every day. We have the Muslim Brotherhood now in the presidency. We have the Salafis, who were there but never operating in a public political mode. The Salafis are now a public actor. We have the revolutionary youth and the remnants of their groups. We have the trade unions. And we have many other such groups like this that are now working out in the open, negotiating, pushing for the new institutions of state that respond to those 5 issues that I mentioned, the 5 demands. What we don't have is a clear agreement yet, any kind of consensus. If you especially look at Tunisia and Egypt, which are the most developed, we still don't have a clear agreement on the issue of minority rights. But the issue is now on the table for the first time. And I would argue that if it is presented as an issue of minority rights, it would be a great step backward for the Arab world. It should be presented as an issue of citizenship, equal rights. So when there's a big debate going on in Egypt and in Tunisia about the Constitution. Does the Constitution say that Islam is the main source of legislation, or Islam is the only source of legislation, or Tunisia is an Arab Islamic country? What does that actually mean to somebody who's neither Arab nor Muslim, and they're a citizen of Tunisia? And people are raising these issues. The question of women. Can a woman be president of Egypt? Can a Christian be president of Egypt? These are issues that are openly debated now, to the point where the Muslim Brothers and some of the Islamic groups that are very powerful now in public politics have had to grapple with these and respond to them for the first time ever in a serious way. And the responses that we're getting are imprecise. But a very important process has started, which is the process of trying to reach a national consensus among all the people of Egypt and Tunisia about these issues of identity, of citizenship rights, of the rights of every citizen, no matter what religion or ethnicity or nationality they belong to. And the process is going to take a long time. And as you can see from the recent show, if the Republican candidates competing for the presidential nomination in the United States, which I sometimes saw as a serious political process and sometimes saw as an extension of Saturday morning cartoons. But if you look at that process, and no offense to any American Republicans here, but it was an extraordinary process. But one of the fascinating elements of it is that they're still discussing the role of religion, which is a good thing, and I tip my hat to the United States. And you're still discussing here the issue of Quebecois nationalism and Canadian citizenship and nationality. It's a sign of your strength that you can do this. The point is, you've been doing it for a couple hundred years, and you're still doing it. And we've been doing it for about 16 months, and we've just started. So I think a little bit of humility is in order, and some patience, to basically understand that the Arab countries are in the very early stages of this process, but that it is a very important a process that has been engaged with a lot of seriousness. And the tough issues are still to come. In Egypt, they haven't yet started the constitutional drafting committee to come up with a new constitution. And then they have to elect a new parliament. And then they have to ratify the constitution. And then same in Libya now, they're just starting this process now. They had one early election, they just named an interim president. Tunisia, they're still grappling with these clauses in the constitution. And essentially, these are debates about the identity of the state. But they're also debates about the rights of every citizen. So they're about the majority and they're about the minority. And the Islamic groups are the most powerful ones right now, but I would caution against overreacting to the Muslim Brotherhood and the Salafis and the other Islamists. I think there's a tendency in the Western world in general to overreact to this phenomenon of Islamist political action and winning elections, etc. And if the important thing that's happening now, and you see this in Egypt and in Tunisia, with all of these groups now out in the public competing for politics, for political power and legitimacy, you have something that is also unprecedented, which is you have political contestation. In other words, the birth of citizenship has also led to the birth of politics in the modern Arab world, in its very early days. And if you look back at Egypt over the last 9 or 10 months only, you see this so clearly. At first, the military tried to, the SCAF, the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces, with the approval of the citizens. There was great citizen approval of the military taking power after Mubarak fell. The military is held in high esteem in Egypt, by the way, and around the Arab world. The army, not the police, but the army, armed forces, are held in high esteem because people see them as protecting the country. The abuse doesn't come from the military, it comes from the police and the mukhabarat and the intelligence and the local police. But there was significant public support for the SCAF military having a role in running the transition. But then when they looked like they were overstretching their power and they tried to take control and keep it for a long time, there was immediate pushback from the Muslim Brotherhood, from the Salafis, and from people back out on Tahrir Square. When the Muslim Brotherhood then won the election and tried to overreach by then running for president, which they said they wouldn't, but then they did, there was immediate pushback from the SCAF and from the street and from the civil society and secular forces. So what you have now, I think, is a very healthy public sphere in which many actors are competing for power and all are checking and balancing each other. It's a very healthy situation for this early stage of our governance transformations. And minorities, if they're worried about their status, which some of them are, they need to get into that battle as citizens learning how to do politics, which is exactly what happened to people in African Americans or the civil rights movement, what happened to the people in Myanmar, what happened with Lech Walesa and the trade union in Gdansk in Poland in 1980, which led to solidarity and the fall of the Soviet Union 10 years later. You need to actively engage in a political challenge to unjust exercise of power. And this is now a possibility which wasn't there before. And the Islamists, who have a lot of power and legitimacy, are also very vulnerable, because if you go back to Egypt again, in the first parliamentary election, I think it was last November, the Islamists altogether won around 70% of the vote. The Muslim Brothers had about 50, the Salafis about 20. It was a huge victory, scared the daylights out of a lot of people. In the period between the parliamentary election and the presidential election, which I think it was June, if I remember, like 7-8 months or so, the Muslim Brothers in that period were not very impressive. They looked like Republican candidates in the United States. They were not very impressive. Their their parliamentary sessions were put live on television. People watched them. They saw them in action, even though they didn't have real power. But they showed what they were made of, and they weren't very impressive. And people didn't want the Muslim Brothers just to sit there and make slogans, and they wanted action. They wanted food prices to be fixed. They wanted decent housing. They wanted jobs. And the next time the Muslim Brothers ran for the presidency, they went down to 25%. From 50% to 25% of those who voted, which is not everybody. it's just a small indication. And then when you had the runoff with the two presidential candidates, the Muslim Brotherhood Morsi and the old guard Shafiq from the old Mubarak era, the Muslim Brotherhood barely squeaked by and barely won. So what this shows us is the Islamist forces have a lot of populist support, but they're also extremely vulnerable and fragile, because if they don't deliver, they don't stay in power. And this is one of the important issues that we need to keep our eye on, and not to be over. How much time do I have left?
Well, you're 4 minutes over. You're 4 minutes over.
4 minutes, okay. So, all right, I'm over. That's what I thought. I was expecting to see a sign, but I didn't.
Technically, you're done.
Okay, I'm done. So much for, well, that's how democracy works, I guess. So, as an Arab Christian constitutional Democrat, I abide by the rules. I thank you for your time, and I urge you to help us achieve our aim.